My name is James Armstead. I'm one of 13 children of Moses Armstead and Helen Armstead. We lived all of our life in Alton here and went to school in Alton. And some of them finished school and some didn't. And I happened to be one of those that didn't finish. As I like to fish and hunt, so I would make out like I was late for school and sometimes wouldn't go. I was supposed to go out to Delmar School. It's out in North Alton. And a fellow that lived just up the street from me, he got tickets to ride the streetcar out to State Street, the end of State Street, and then they walked over to school. But I just lived about a block and a half from Richard Mann's, and he got the tickets, but they would not give me tickets. So I just said, well, I was too far for me to walk anyhow, so I just quit. And my mother, you know, with 13 children, it's quite a chore to take care of them, you understand what I'm saying? So she didn't push it to make me go to school, so I just quit. I've got, guess, about 13, 14 years old. And I started going out to my grandfather's out at Wood Station, and he lived in a log cabin up in the woods. So I would go out there and stay with him for 2 or 3 days, and especially on the weekend when my parents would come out and they'd have dinner, kind of like a little picnic. And my mother's sister, Minnie Curtis, and her family, her kids, and when I had an uncle by the name of Jim Stewart, and the families would get together and they'd have a little dinner out there. And back in them times, well, they made lemonade. Had a big 5-gallon crock, and they made lemonade, and so that's what we had to drink. And of course, with family, usually there's several different kinds of food. So we enjoyed ourselves very much. Mexico, they tell me it got its name from the Mexicans. Said it was a bunch of Mexicans came up in there and settled. Our home was at 1206 Hampton Street. That was a block off of Highland. Highland Avenue years ago, they called it, before, I can remember before it was ever paved, they called it Bloomfield Street. And they changed the name years later to Highland Avenue. And Brown Street was Vandalia Road. That's what from 7th, you know, where 7th where it comes into to Brown, on down to Brown, and it went on out past Upper Alton there. I don't know, remember, after it got to Worthington Avenue, I don't know which way it went then. I do remember Mexicans coming up in there to, there was a tent meeting on Highland Avenue. They had a great big tent there, and a fellow by the name of Reverend Hollis, he was the preacher. And they used to come up there and they'd get happy and they'd get to dancing and playing, you know, music, one thing and another, and they would come up there to listen to them, one thing and another. And they had a fellow by the name of Tyne Derricks, and Tyne, he played the bass horn. And then there's Miss Phillips, she played the drums, and McFarland, piano. Oh, they had it all mixed up there. But they'd get to stomping, and I tell you, girl, it was really something. But at the Temple Theater, they had a little ticket. And when you'd go to the show, they'd give you one of these tickets And the next time you come to the theater, you had, with that ticket, you could get in for a dime. But during that time, all of them, the Princess and the Grand and the Temple Theater, the colored set upstairs. And they got a place they called it Peanut Heaven. Well, anybody could sit up there, but that's where they mostly put the colors upstairs. But in those days, you go to show 15 cents, 10, 15 cents. And the Princess Theater, that was down on Broadway, across the street from Wedge Bank. And they had the first, I think it was first 4 rows in the back on that side over there. And the Hippodrome was the same way, and they had fire escape up to where the colored set. Yeah, that was when they put the building in. That's where they put the fire escape, but they didn't know they were going to use that for the colored, and that's where they put the colored. And ever so often, somebody with a couple of guys get together, and one would pay to go in, see, and the other guy would go down and climb up to go up this fire escape and open the door, and a couple of 2 or 3 other guys would come in free. Yeah, the Hippodrome, that's set right there, Pie-Saw and Broadway, right where they got that parking lot for the boat. That's where the old Hippodrome used to be. Mr. Taylor had a little grocery store there, and he had a son named Richard. Richard ran the store. But then they had a younger brother by the name of Beans. And Beans, Mr. Taylor, would just, because Beans was the youngest son, he'd always do a little more for him than he did for the other kids. So he bought him a little Shetland pony. And every once in a while, we'd go up there, and Beans or Rich or somebody would let us take Daisy, that was the horse's name, to the watering trough, which was down by the glassworks. And we'd take her down there and water her and then come on back up. But, years ago, they had watering troughs all over town. They had one at 9th Street where you go up that long hill. When you got to the top of the hill, there's a watering trough there. And then one over here on Central Avenue and Union Street, we had a watering trough there. And they had one in Upper Alton, what they call Pie Town. And out north on at the end of Delmore, they had another watering trough. There was 5 or 6 watering troughs where they had for these horses. And back in those days, they didn't have all that many automobiles. And naturally, when they hauling coal and such as that, when the horses got to the top of the hill, it was out, you know, I mean, wanting something to drink. So that's what they did. City had pipes running to fill them. Yeah. And you know, it's just like with the basement now. The way I understand it, they had floats, and when it would get full, it would shut off. Now that's the way I imagine. I never did really know, but I know it came from the city. I used to love to ice skate, and down home at our home place, well, below there was a hollow, a big hollow in there, and whenever it would rain, especially in the fall of the year, well, that would fill up with water because the water couldn't drain out, and it would freeze over. We'd ice skate down there, and I was always down there. But anyhow, and whenever I'd go down, I'd get the croup. You had the croup, and Mom would have to get up at nighttime and fix me some, either rub me down with goose grease and make a plaster, put on my chest, and sometimes she'd make onion juice, you know, and even went so far, sometimes she'd give me a couple of drops of turpentine on sugar. to cut that phlegm. And it helped. It really did. And many a night that I just laid in the bed and you, ooh, ooh, ooh. Yeah. But it finally left. A fellow that owned the ground out there, his name was Saul North. And he raised a boy by the name of Virgil Blackwell, and Virgil and I were about the same age, so we hung out together and hunted and fished. Virgil and I, we had good times together, I tell you. I'd kill rabbits or something like that, and my grandfather, he'd cook up one of them. But the other ones, I could sell for 15 cents. Sometimes, if it would run low on shells, we'd charge a little more. Yes, and naturally, after we got up a little older, we started running for the girls over to Edwardsville. And that didn't last long, though. My brother had a Model T Ford, and once in a while he'd let me drive it. Yeah. In those days, you could buy gasoline for around 12, 15 cents a gallon. And with a Model T, you could run a long ways on a gallon of gas. And years later, when he got upgrown to be a man, he left this part of the country and went up around Michigan. And he was gone, I guess, for 60 years or so, and I never heard from him or knew where. I knew where he was, but no one had ever had an address. So Helen Jackson, which was a cousin of his, I seen her one evening, and she said she could get his address, so she got it. Her name now is Helen Smith. So she married Joel Smith, and she gave me his address, and also she found his telephone number. So I called Virgil, and I talked to him for, a couple of different times. And he finally got sick and moved to another town, and so I lost contact with him. But later on, I found out that he had passed away. My grandfather, his name was William Stewart. They called him Pid Stewart. He was of a large family too. I can't remember the names of some of them, but I don't know where they were living before he moved to the cabin. My grandmother passed when she gave birth to a set of twin boys, and then the kids were adopted, some of them out to the neighbors, and then these twin babies, they left here after they got up to be a pretty good age. I can't remember, I never did hear them say it, but some of Saul North's people adopted one of the boys, and the other boy, they lost contact with him, and they don't know where he went. Then Grandpa got this cabin built. I don't know who helped him build it or anything like that, because that was way back there. And it's set up on top of the hill in a flat place, kind of like a little plateau, And it was clear all around the cabin, I'd say, for maybe 40 to 50 foot. And maybe some places was longer than that. And you could hear the animals come up at nighttime and sometimes drink water or something or other. And he had a black snake that stayed underneath the floor of the cabin. And he didn't have any mice around. They took care of the mice, yeah. and he would work around different farmers out there. He's crippled. He had a tree to fall on his leg and to cripple him up. And so they used to call him Clubby because he was had to kind of lift that leg and kind of drag it and lift it, you know. And he would, if he got sick or something like that, he would go down in the woods or out in the field there sometime and get hold of some kind of a weed and chew it or make a tea, and it took care of whatever the ailment was. And I didn't take it in. It went in one ear and came out the other ear. But now I wish I'd have remembered that, because this medicine that they give you nowadays, it'll cure or kill you. Yeah. When he passed, he was 84, I believe. I'm pretty sure it was 84. He was buried up on the Blue Ridge Road. And the graveyard was just a little old cutout place in the field. It had some pine trees and other bushes in it, and that's where he was buried. But the day of his funeral, it was pretty cold, pretty stiff, and they couldn't pull all the way up to the graveyard, the little, you know, the old hearse that they had. Back in those days, the country roads were all mud. You know, when it would rain, snow or something, and they'd get ruts in there for your Model T Ford or wagon or whatever, and you had to stay in that rut until you found a place where it you could kind of pull off on it. The front wheels would, you know, get out of the rut. And sometimes you'd be going down the road sideways. And they had to walk, I'd say, a couple 200 feet or more to the graveyard from where the hearse was. And I remember them burying him, and I thought I'd get the spot in my head so I could remember just where it was, because they hadn't put a stone on there, and they never did get a stone on it. So I went back years later after I growed up, and I couldn't find his grave. But there were some older people in there. I can't remember their names right offhand. Well, anyhow, here just a couple of years ago, I think it's been about 6, 7 years ago, the man that owned the farm wanted to plow the graveyard up because it was so old that he wanted, you know, raise crops on it. And Carlinville, that's the Magoupin County courthouse. That's where the courthouse is, Magoupin County. And they wouldn't allow him to do it, because cemeteries, you're not supposed to disturb them in any way. So the little old cemetery is still up there, and I haven't been up in there for years. But every time I pass her, I think about my good times I have with Grandpa. Yeah. He just was a bachelor. He didn't have any cattle or anything. He just had a little cabin up in there, and summertime he'd raise a little garden, something or other. And there was an orchard on the other side of where he lived. It belonged to Saul North. It was a peach orchard. And he'd get a little fruit over there. And spring of the year, well, he'd get wild onions and eggs, and he'd take bacon grease and put these, wait a minute now, I'm getting ahead of my story. But he would cut these onions up, wild onions up. They look just like garlic, only a garlic has got a round stem to it, and a wild onion has a flat stem. And they cut them up in small pieces and put them in a skillet and put some water in it and stew them. And then when they got down real low, well, they'd take some bacon grease and put in a skillet and throw in 2 or 3 eggs and scramble them up. and that was breakfast. And potatoes, little marble potatoes, he'd always take those and boil them until they got done, and then he'd take them out and put them on a plate, take his fork, mash them up, put bacon grease and salt and pepper on them, and they was delicious. Oh, he didn't have a well. He had a cistern, what they call a cistern, and it was rainwater. And his drinking water, he'd have to go up to the neighbors, which is, I'd say, I guess must have been 1,000 feet from where he lived, and get his drinking water. And he'd have a couple gallon jugs that he would get his water in. And there's a many a day that I've had to walk up. I didn't have to, but I did go up there because he told me to. And I'd go up there and get a couple gallons of water. And sometimes on the way back, I'd have to stop and rest a while because, it was kind of heavy for me. But I enjoyed it, and he was glad whenever I would come out there because it was company for him, Yeah. Yeah, and I telling you about the old railroad train tracks. We could almost tell the time of the day by that train. It'd come down at the same time practically every day. And once in the morning around about 9 o'clock, it went north, up through Brighton and on up that area. And around 4 o'clock in the evening, it came back down through Alton. And there was days that weather was bad, and my grandfather would have to come to town. Well, they had a little old station set down the hill below Lathy Martin's house. And he'd walk down to that little old shed, and the train would stop, and he'd get on and ride down to College Avenue. Back in those days, there was a swimming pool down there. They called it Lindbergh Park. And for 10 cents, that's what it cost. That was his fare. And in the evening, sometimes, if somebody didn't take him back home, he'd get out there no, somebody had to take him back home. That's the way it was. Or else he could get on a railroad track and walk up the track to home. Yeah. He walked like he was, I guess, way up in his 70s years of age, and sometimes he'd still walk on into Alton. And there was other times that Saul North, he raised horses, and he had a racehorse they called Lardee. And he would hitch her up to a buggy and come on to town. And then in the evening, when he got ready to go back home, he came in to get his groceries, for the week. And in the evening, when he got ready to go back home, he'd go down seminary, get the horse up to seminary, and he could just turn the horse, lines loose, and the horse would take him right on home. Yeah, many a time. And Saul North, he raised a horse. He had a stud horse by the name of King, and he had a old mule, old Jack they called him, and he was another one they could tell time by. He would, what do you call it, bay? I guess you call it bay. Make this noise, and it gets so far down that it sounded like it was squeaking. It was something, I tell you. But anyhow, after Mr. North died, well, they got rid of the horses and things. My grandfather told me Saul North's wife's brother He was a mail carrier over in St. Louis. I don't know whether it was the city of St. Louis or whether it was one of the suburbs or just where it was. That's Saul North's wife. She was a North, married to North. And he told me that there's a place over across the hollow from where he lived. It was a pasture which belonged to Gene North. And he says Mrs. North's brother was working on a plane. He called it, he didn't know what it was really. Anyhow, it come to be that he was working on a deal for these helicopters or whatever you call it. He said it can land right up there in that field, and said it can take off from that field. And North, if you, well, you remember, and I read anything about it, but North was the one that invented the helicopter. That's what I was told now. We used to swim in that creek out there. Water wash out a hole. We'd swim in there. And in spring of the year, and a lot of time the fall of the year, that creek would rise. And there wasn't no bridge over it or nothing. You could wade across it in the summertime. The water would come up to maybe to your knees. But in the wintertime, Grandpa, he got permission from Mr. North to cut down a tree, and he cut down that tree and threw it across the creek and trimmed all the branches and everything off of it. And then when he got ready to go across the creek, they'd walk across that creek. And there had been several times that different woods fell off the tree. Couldn't, you know, they couldn't walk straight. Yeah, there was some times out there, I tell you. And then I tell you another place. There was a bridge on Cy Johnson's farm that went across the creek. It was a swinging bridge. Sometimes that water would get high enough to kind of wash it away, and they'd have to repair it. It was just a small creek. It came from, you know where you go down the bottom and go around Torch Cliff? Well, you cross that, yeah. That was one right there, yeah. I was just a young kid. And I used to go over to the pond, fish. Get that little catfish in there. You know, just about that long. And I'd catch them and take them up to the house, up to the cabin, and Grandpa would fry them up. And boy, there was some big water boxes of steaks at that place too. Ooh, I tell you, there was some big ones. But anyhow, I heard when I was on my way out there, and I hadn't been over to, you know, the Johnson's place for, you know, well, I guess a couple of weeks or so. And I'd hear some hammering, whoop, 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 and there was a pile. They was driving this rod down in the ground. When they're building a bridge or something like that, they have what they call a pile driver, and it's operated by steam, and then well, that's the way this noise was going. And I asked my grandfather one day what that was, and he said that they're drilling for oil over on Johnson's place. And I said, where? He said, over by the pond. And naturally, I had to go over there, but they wouldn't let me up close. But anyhow, I could see this machinery operating, and I never did find out what the outcome of it was. But now that, you know, that's been, what, 70 years ago. Pretty much every 70 years. Because I'll be 87 the 4th of October. And I was, like I said, I was only about 12, 13 years old, something like that. Yeah. I never will forget it. One day I was squirrel hunting, and I tried down from the pond, and a great big old elm tree there, and I knew there was a squirrel den around there, a couple of them. So I was sitting there on the stump and looking around and waiting to see if I could find a squirrel. And all of a sudden I heard something, thump, and a great big black snake fell out of the tree right down beside me. Yeah, that's what I did. I got up there. Yeah. But this claim that a black snake won't bother you. You know. My grandfather had one under this cabin. He'd catch mice. Another experience I had, there was some people by the name of, the man's name was John Dent Stuprich. Had a farm, that's where we used to go get the water. And I got old enough to, I don't know, 18 or 19 years old, and squirrel hunting and such. And I had a certain place I used to go to just sit and wait on squirrels. And I was sitting there one day, and I looked, and there was the cattle, the cows, right down under this was a mulberry tree there. When they was round down there just sunning and such. And I looked, and there was a snake sucking the cow's tit. And that's one experience I never will forget. And I had heard that, but I'd never seen it. They called them cow snakes. And they claim that this cow would go back to that certain place every day, and that snake would get that milk. Yes, sir, that's what they claim. And I actually seen that. There's no problem for a snake to get a cow's tit in its mouth, because that saliva and stuff that they put on there makes it slick. That's the same way when they're got a fish or a frog or something or other. They can't swallow it right away. And it has to lay there in their mouth until it gets enough saliva and stuff that it'll slip right on down. I've seen them snakes with frogs in their mouth too. Yes, sir. During Depression, giving somebody, the boys, something to do. They went around and planted trees and things to beautify the land, and also to save erosion and stuff like that. They planted trees and different things. Well, my first job I had was taking a cow to pasture. My neighbor next door, her name was Ferrix, and Freddie Ferrix, and he had a cow, and I would take the cow over to pasture 5 days a week, and I'd get 50 cents. And then from there I went to work the bowling alley. And my first long pants suit that I really remember, I tore the pants, sitting pins. And I worked the bowling alley for quite a while, and then after I got a little older, my brother Ed was chef down at the glassworks, and he got me a job down there washing dishes and kind of cleaning up, you know. And I stayed there a few years, and finally I left there and went to a place they call the dress factory, Co-ed Frocks. And I worked there about 3 years, I think. And I took care of the treadles on the machines. It's the sewing machines. I took care of those, and the belts would break or something like that, and I'd replace them. And after that, I loafed. I didn't do anything for a while. I couldn't get a job. My grandfather, that is my dad's father, his name was Robinson Yancey Armstrong, and his wife's name was Martha Armstead. His mother was Elizabeth Jane Brown, and I had heard at different times that she was a gypsy, so I don't really know. Robinson Armstead, 5/1/1857, and Martha Armstead was 11/13/1865. Her children was Tilly, Lizzie, Moses, which was my father, Roy, Willie, which I never knew him because he passed at an early age, and then Charles, Rosie, Bob, Dick, Joe, Katie, Nita, and Josephine. Now that was the family of Robinson Yancey and Martha Irma Armstead. They're all gone now. They all passed. There's none of them living today. Juanita, she married a fellow by the name of Arthur Blodgett, and his people originated from Brighton, Illinois. All the boys passed. Well, the whole family's gone now, I'll put it that way. But Josephine and Juanita left here and went up to Buffalo, New York, and that's where they passed. Juanita still has some kids that's living in Buffalo, New York. Josephine, she only had one child, and it got killed in an automobile wreck. And I don't remember the date or anything like that. My dad's family moved here from Carlisle, Illinois. And his father, I heard, came from Louisiana here to Illinois. And he was a carpenter out at the steel mill when they was building the steel mill. I don't know just what kind of work he did on doing the carpenter work, but I mean what he built or anything like that. But that's what I heard. The Cleed steel. My mother's family was raised up around Blue Ridge Road. That's up going up like you're going out to Fosterburg. And my grandmother passed when she gave birth to a set of twins, 2 boys. And that's when the older children was, you know, they were up pretty good age and they could take care of themselves pretty well. But my mother, it was a lady by the name of Hammonds that lived across the field. You know, I told you where the Swinging Bridge was. There was a house back up in the hills that they called it Hammonds, and that's where this Mrs. Hammonds raised my mother up to be pretty good size, and then finally she got married. I never did know of the Mrs. Hammonds or anything like that. It's just hearsay that it came about this. Yeah. My mother was a steward. There was a Jim Stewart, that was my mother's brother. He has one daughter, 2 daughters living. One of them was named Dorothy, and the other was Catherine Allen. She married a fellow by the name of Pearl Allen. He was a piano player. And he passed, but she's still living. And Dorothy, she's out in Seattle, Washington. Her husband's died. And she's up, I guess, she's in her 90s. I guess she's right. She's about 91 years old. And she's still going strong. Yeah. The oldest son was Fulton. Fulton, well, when he got grown, he went to work at the Tannery, the International Shoe Company. And he worked down there for quite a few years, and then work kind of slacked up. and he and a couple, two or three other fellows left Alton and went to Buffalo, New York in a Model T Ford. He didn't stay too long, and he came back home. Oh, he came back home and he married a woman by the name of Harriet. But anyhow, they separated, and then he married the Undertaker's daughter, Dorothy Russell. And they lived over on Cyrus Street. Cyrus, that's over in Mexico. Oh, as you're coming out of Mexico, going, yeah. As he got older, well, he contracted TB, tuberculosis. And eventually he passed from it, but he lived with it for many a year. And Sylvester, that we called him Red, he liked to play golf. And he was a chef down at the glassworks. And he eventually got married, but he didn't have any children. And he left here and went out to Tacoma, Washington. And out there he played golf, and he won the championship for the city of Tacoma. And eventually he went into service, and it wasn't after he put in 20 years, and after that he lived about 3 years. But when we knew where he was, that he went to Fort Lewis, that's in Tacoma, and we knew that that's where he was stationed. And we didn't hear anything from him for years and years and years. And finally, he called home one day. And he came back here and lived for a short while, and then went back to Tacoma, and he passed out there. And then Smiley, Edward, he got a job at the steel mill. He was a little foreman out at the steel mill for a while, and finally he quit that job and went to work at the post office, and he sorted mail and picked up mail from the mailboxes and such as that. And he finally had a heart attack while he was on the job, but he did had enough to remember to pull into the curb so he pulled into the curb and avoided a wreck or anything. But he's still living. He has a pacemaker, but he's still going strong. He'll be 88 years old February. Well, his first marriage was to a woman by the name of Willamay. Now, I never did really know her last name, but a fellow by the name of Johnson raised her, because he married her mother and raised her as a child. And this Johnson, he had a brother named Fred Johnson and a sister, I don't know what her name was, but she taught school here in Alton. And the other guy, the one they called James, he worked at the glass works in the soup house with his brother Red. Helen, that was my sister. She went for years and years before she got married, and she's like I was. I was 28 years old before I ever got married. And she married a fellow by the name of Alvy Mack, and she worked out at different homes. Mack worked at Duncan's Foundry, and then there was Marion. She worked up to Shirtliff College. She was a cook up there, and she worked on until it changed over to SIU. Finally, she passed here. And then, let's see, there came Margaret. Margaret left here and went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And she married a fellow by the name of Dempster Johnson. And she passed up in Milwaukee. And he also passed. And then we had Sister Eunice Lucille. She worked for Hartman's clothing store. She did seamstress work and that. And I guess she lived up to be 65, 67 years old, somewhere along in there. And finally she passed. Rose, she married a fellow by the name of Louis Bratton, and they had quite a few kids. The kids are still around. And they separated, and eventually he died. He worked worked at the steel mill for years, and he was a melter at the time that he died. He made good money. And then Nida, she was a baby girl. She married a fellow by the name of Gleghorn, Deneen Gleghorn, and they had 2 children. And she's still around, and so are the children. And I had a brother named Joseph. He was a valedictorian of his class. And he went into service, and when he came out of service, he moved to Baltimore, and got married. And he had, him and his wife had 3 children, I think. He taught school and also worked at the Pentagon. He had a throat operation, and it wasn't too long after that till he passed. And then I have a brother named Charles. He's the youngest. And he went in service in the Navy for quite a while, and then he came out. And I was working at Bell Telephone, and I got him a job down at a telephone company. And he liked to piddle around old cars when he was young. And after he came back out of service, he started working again on, and he worked at a telephone company in building service work. And finally, they started hiring colored, and he worked up to be a taking care of the cars, washing and polishing the cars. And he was on that job about 3 years, and finally he made a mechanic, and that's where he retired from, as a mechanic for the telephone company. And that's the Armstead family. Betty Jo, her daddy was my mother's brother, and her mother was named Margaret Churchill, and she lived in Brighton. The family, old man Churchill, he farmed up in Jerseyville. He had a nice farm up there. I mean, in Brighton, he had nice. But eventually, the big farmers outrooted the small ones, so he had to give up farming. But Margaret married my mother's brother, George Stewart, and they had 3 children, and Betty Jo was the youngest, and her mother died giving birth to Betty Jo. And my mother taken Betty Jo and raised her, and she stayed with Mom until she got to be up quite a young lady. And finally she married a fellow by the name of Lester Tate, and Lester got killed. So then she married McLemore. They called him T. McLemore. and eventually she passed. I was 28 years old when I met my wife. I had seen her before, but to date her, I was 28 years old. And I was down in Brooklyn, Illinois. They had a place down there called Club Plantation. And it was on weekends. And we'd go down there, and I happened to go down there one Saturday night, and she came down there with another fella, and she had a girl, was a Mexican, and her auntie raised this girl, Mary, and I seen Eleanor, and she said to her something. I don't remember just what she said, but anyhow, we got together, and we made a date, and from then on, well, it was it. And I was, like I said, I was 28 years old, so I had quite a bit of running around that I did. And they had a tavern, they called it the Idle Hour, down on Highland Avenue, and a fellow by the name of Clyde Adams bought this from Donaldson. And his wife was going to have a child, and she was in labor and one thing and another, and I happened to be down there that day, and he asked me if I'd take over until he got back from the hospital. And so I stayed there, and I worked, I guess, for a couple of months, just extra bartender. In the meantime, I was still dating Eleanor. And so we decided we were going to get married. So I didn't have a job. I just worked a little bit at the tavern now and then. So I got a fellow by the name of William Connors, they called him Dilly, and another guy, Isidore Cornish, and Isidore had a car. So we went to St. Charles and got married and came back. Of course, naturally, I had to stop at the tavern for the first thing to buy the boys a little drink or something or other. And from then on, well, I left I didn't go back to the tavern anymore. That is to work. And our first child, Eleanor, she wasn't drinking anything or doing that. It's a dirty shame I pulled a trick on her. She's drinking Coca-Cola, and every once in a while the bartender would spike it. But she got sick, and I never did that anymore. But she didn't care too much about it. She would take a nip now and then, but she didn't care for her. Yeah. She's one sweet old gal. Yeah. We had a lot of times, good times. I say we'd have been married, I got married in what, 60 years, I guess. She passed 95, December 16th. She was a person, she made friends real easy, and she could talk to anybody, and she loved to write, and she wrote little poems and stories, but she never did get nothing published. Got, I guess, 2 or 3 boxes of stuff in there that she wrote poems and different things. Yeah, she really loved it. And so she was cremated, and on the stone it had a pen and a little book where she was writing, you know. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know one thing, she got me straightened out real fast. Yeah, and I was out good timing and such as that. But after I got married, I settled down. My children? Philip, that was my oldest son, and he fell off the bluffs up here in 1962. And then there's Tony, that's James. And when he was born, he come up with asthma. And I would have to take him down to Lebanon to an old country doctor down there, and he'd fix him up some kind of cough syrup and one thing or another, and it helped him. And Tony was going over to the school over on State Street. He was going over to West Junior, and he had this asthma, but the doctor gave him a thing to pump, and if he was going up a hill or something like that, he'd have to stop and take a few squirts of this, what do they call it? Anyhow, and then he'd get his breath and he could walk on. But he outgrew it. And now he's working down at Clark's refinery. He's been down there almost 25 years or better, and he's doing just fine. And he comes by here to see me practically every day that he can. And he's moved to Edwardsville. But he still comes by here to check on me, see how I'm doing. Yeah. I have some good children, I have to say it there. They look after their old dad. Sometimes they're a little bit too strict on him. Anita, she graduated from high school and got to the age where that she thought she ought to be going out and getting married or whatever. And anyhow, she did. And she married a fellow by the name of Jack Edwards. Well, first she went to work at the glassworks. She worked on the glassworks packing house. And then she married Jack and they moved to Ford. Ford people moved out to California. They had a couple, two girls at that time. And she went to work some plant out there. I don't know just what it was. But then she worked a while, and then finally she got pregnant again and she had to quit work. And she stayed out there, I guess, 5 or 6 years. But anyhow, they separated. And she left out there and came back to Alton. And she went, this house over next door here was empty at that time. She came back just when that house was empty. So we got her in there. And she went to work down to J.C. Penney's when they had the outlet down there. And she worked there for quite a few years. And I don't know, but something happened. She left there and she went to work for some people by the name of Raymer that had a place down East Alton where they serviced trailers and one thing and another. And the woman just here a few years ago died up here off of Bunker Hill, not Bunker Hill, but it was the old Bunker Hill Road, Raymer. And then she came back here and anyhow, she ended up, my daughter Vicki helped her to get a job over in St. Louis at one of the banks, and that's where she is today. Vicki June, she was the baby girl, and she was pretty smart. She was up, and she went to work for some people by the name of Rogers. He was real estate, went a real estate business years later, but one time he was dealing in cars. And she went to work for them, and after that, well, my son Jeffrey got married out in New York, in Peekskill, New York. And we went to the wedding. She went along, and he met a girl, Gloria. I can't think of Gloria's last name. But anyhow, Gloria was up to his education. And Gloria decided her and Vicky got together and they clicked, pretty good. And she left out there and came to Alton just for a visit. And she kind of liked Alton, so she decided she was going to move down there. So she came down here and went to work over in St. Louis. Some big construction company over there. And Vicky was working for Rogers at that time, and Gloria talked to her and got her to put in applications, and she got a job over at the Federal Bank in St. Louis, and that's where she's 15 years or so. And finally, along come Kamal. So Kamal was staying up there at Principia, yeah. And there was a girl was trying to date him, and she'd go up there and get him, bring him down all one thing and another. And then somehow or another, him and Vicky got together, and they decided they were going to get married. So there they are. And Vicky, her and Lynn and another girl right at the present time, I went down to North Carolina to visit Gloria, and that's where they are now. Jeffrey, we're Jehovah's Witnesses. They have a place in New York where the headquarters is in Brooklyn. It's really nice, and it's decided he wanted to go out there, so he had to be selected in order to go. He had to approve, that he was okay, and that we was, out there. They've got a farm. The Witness has a big farm where they raise their hogs and their meat, milk. They have a dairy. They make cheese. Anyhow, he went out there and he met this girl, Francine Berry. And the first thing we knew, they came to Alton on a visit, and we met her, and she seemed, off the field, a nice girl. So she worked for IBM for years, and they got married. Maurice, he's the baby, the youngest boy, and he graduated from high school, and he worked golf course for a while. And he quit that and finally got a job down to Glassworks, and as a machinist. He learned to be a machinist. And he worked, and finally, what happened? Oh, they started laying off, that's right. And there was Marty and Deneen Gleghorn, that was Nida's husband, and Hickman. Well, there's about 4 colored fellows that got laid off, and Marty loafed around. I tried to get him to go on and take up electronics because he's got a pretty good brain for anything like that, and he could have went to another town to finish out his apprenticeship, but he didn't want to leave home. And finally, he got a job down at Olin's. After he got let out down here, he got a job down at Olin's, and he's been down at Olin's for about 15 or 18 years. And he finally got married. He married a girl named Cara Palda. He seemed to be doing all right now. Well, I worked Laclede. I went to work around 40, I think it was, and I worked on the yard, and that's where they labor work. And they had what they call the open hearth. That's where they melted the steel and had the furnaces and such as that. And my first job down at the steel mill, I went to work in the evening, and one of the furnaces that went down had to be repaired, you know. And they have these ladles and the furnaces. When they shut down, it takes, I don't know, a week sometime for them to cool off so that you can go in into work. But they didn't wait till it went completely cool. And when it got to the place where they could stand it, well, they would take jackhammers, and they'd have thick boards, and they'd throw these boards in at the bottom of the furnace. And sometimes those boards would catch on fire. It wouldn't blaze, but it would just smolder, you know. And you use that jackhammer, and that jackhammer is shaking you. And I went in there, and I worked about 5 minutes, and I said, "Ooh, I got to come out of here." So I came on out, but I went back later and till we got it cleaned out. And then another time, they had what they call soaking pits. That's where they mold this steel. They pour it in molds, big thick iron mold like that, and they take it over to the soaking pits and reheat it, and then it goes into the rolling mill. That's where they roll it out in strips, such as that. And one evening they sent us up in that. We'd worked all day, and they wanted us to work overtime, and but we wasn't working in the soaking pits all day. It was out maybe on the railroad or something like that. And we had a foreman by the name of Gus Bonifet. He was an Italian, and he kind of looked out for me. He'd give me little easy jobs. And we had this soaking pit job to do, and I went down in there, and this board got to smoking. We had wooden shoes, and got to smoking, so I came out and I went to the office, to the yard office. That's where the yard superintendent was. And I told him, I said, Roy Bogart was his name. And I said, Roy, I says, I worked out here all day, and I says, they sent me down into the soaking pit, and I said, I just cannot take it, I'm going home. And he never even answered me. So I went on home. Next morning I went back to work. He never said a word. He didn't say a word, and I worked there until my father-in-law got me a job at the Bell Telephone house in the building service work as janitorial and stuff like that. And I worked there for 24 years I worked there. And finally I got to a place where I was getting, close to retirement. And I went to the wire chief, he's over everything around Alton, and asked if he couldn't find something for me to do to kind of boost my pension up. And he said, he says, yeah. He says, I didn't know that you wanted to be moved. He said, you could have been moved a long time ago. And I'm a person, I can't stand no heights. And I had to climb poles and such as that, and that was one reason I didn't try to get out. But anyhow, he got me, he told me, he said, well, Jim, he said, it's going to take maybe a year or longer to move you. He says, we have to find something that you can do. And he says, another thing, he says, things have been a little rough right along through. They wasn't doing any iron. And one day he came to me, he said, well, he says, everything's all right. He says, you go over to the plant. And I went over to the plant, and he gave me a job working with a fellow that plows the cable. That's the area, cable. They have a cable in that, the wire going to the house. Well, they was burying those under the ground at that time. And so that was the job that he gave me, to work with a fellow by the name of Lee Morrow. And Lee Morrow, he was from Carrollton. And he would see me working, and he'd come over. He operated the equipment, see, and I did the laboring work. And he'd see me working there, and he'd come over and say, "Give me that shovel, old man." He said, "Get on out of here." And he'd go on and finish the job. And he was that way. He carried me through until I retired. And right to still, I've been retired 24 years. And right today, old Lee, every spring he'd bring me down a big mess of mushrooms. Yeah. He's one fine guy. And another thing, his mom and dad ran a tavern up in Carrollton. They called it the Y. It's where 108 and I guess it was 267 went up through Greenville up that way. They ran a tavern up there, and there was a few colored families in Carrollton at that time, and they'd go over and go to the tavern. And they had a basement downstairs, and they'd go downstairs and have their parties and one thing and another. And I happened to be one of them. Yeah. And old Lee was all right.